Such, then, were the events of this year. When Phaon was archon in Athens, in Rome the consulship was taken over by Lucius Furius Mediolanus and Marcus Manilius Vaso. During this year, a great and incredible catastrophe befell the Lacedaemonians, for great earthquakes occurred in Sparta, and as a result the houses collapsed from their foundations and more than 20,000 Lacedaemonians perished. And since the tumbling down of the city and the falling in of the houses continued uninterruptedly over a long period, many persons were caught and crushed in the collapse of the walls, and no little household property was ruined by the quake. And although they suffered this disaster because some god, as it were, was wreaking his anger upon them, it so happened that other dangers befell them at the hands of men for the following reason. The Helots and Messenians, although enemies of the Lacedaemonians, had remained quiet up to this time, since they stood in fear of the eminent position and power of Sparta. But when they observed that the larger part of them had perished because of the earthquake, they held in contempt the survivors, who were few. Consequently, they came to an agreement with each other and joined together in the war against the Lacedaemonians. The king of the Lacedaemonians, Archidamus, by his personal foresight, not only was the savior of his fellow citizens even during the earthquake, but in the course of the war also he bravely fought the aggressors. For instance, when the terrible earthquake struck Sparta, he was the first Spartan to seize his armor and hasten from the city into the country, calling upon the other citizens to follow his example. The Spartans obeyed him, and thus those who survived the shock were saved, and these men King Archidamus organized into an army and prepared to make war upon the revolters. The Messenians, together with the Helots, at first advanced against the city of Sparta, assuming that they would take it because there would be no one to defend it. But when they heard that the survivors were drawn up in a body with Archidamus the king, and were ready for the struggle on behalf of their native land, they gave up this plan, and seizing a stronghold in Messenia, they made it their base of operations, and from there continued to overrun Laconia. And the Spartans, turning for help to the Athenians, received from them an army, and they gathered troops as well from the rest of their allies, and thus became able to meet their enemy on equal terms. At the outset, they were much superior to the enemy, but at a later time, when a suspicion arose that the Athenians were about to go over to the Messenians, they broke the alliance with them, stating as their reason that in the other allies they had sufficient men to meet the impending battle. The Athenians, although they believed that they had suffered an affront at the time, did no more than withdraw. Later, however, their relations to the Lacedaemonians being unfriendly, they were more and more inclined to fan the flames of hatred. Consequently, the Athenians took this incident as the first cause of the estrangement of the two states, and later on they quarrelled and, embarking upon great wars, filled all Greece with vast calamity. But we shall give an account of these matters severally in connection with the appropriate periods of time. At the time in question, the Lacedaemonians, together with their allies, marched forth against Ithome and laid siege to it. And the Helots, revolting in a body from the Lacedaemonians, joined as allies with the Messenians, and at one time they were winning and at another losing. And since for 10 years no decision could be reached in the war, for that length of time they never ceased injuring each other. The following year, Theagonides was archon in Athens, and in Rome the consuls elected were Lucius Aemilius Mamercus and Lucius Julius Iulus, and the 78th Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Parmenides of Posidonia won the Stadion. In this year, a war broke out between the Argives and Mycenaeans for the following reasons. The Mycenaeans, because of the ancient prestige of their country, would not be subservient to the Argives as the other cities of Argolis were, but they maintained an independent position and would take no orders from the Argives, and they kept disputing with them also over the shrine of Hera and claiming that they had the right to administer the Nemean games by themselves. Furthermore, when the Argives voted not to join with the Lacedaemonians in the battle at Thermopylae unless they were given a share in the supreme command, the Mycenaeans were the only people of Argolis who fought at the side of the Lacedaemonians. In a word, the Argives were suspicious of the Mycenaeans, fearing lest, if they got any stronger, they might, on the strength of the ancient prestige of Mycenae, dispute the right of Argos to the leadership. Such, then, were the reasons for the bad blood between them. And from of old the Argives had ever been eager to exalt their city, and now they thought they had a favourable opportunity, seeing that the Lacedaemonians had been weakened and were unable to come to the aid of the Mycenaeans. Therefore, the Argives, gathering a strong army from both Argos and the cities of their allies, marched against the Mycenaeans, and after defeating them in battle and shutting them within their walls, they laid siege to the city. The Mycenaeans for a time resisted the besiegers with vigor, but afterwards, since they were being worsted in the fighting and the Lacedaemonians could bring them no aid because of their own wars and the disaster that had overtaken them in the earthquakes, and since there were no other allies, they were taken by storm through lack of support from outside. The Argives sold the Mycenaeans into slavery, dedicated a 10th part of them to the god, and razed Mycenae. So this city, which in ancient times had enjoyed such felicity, possessing great men and having to its credit memorable achievements, met with such an end, and has remained uninhabited down to our own time. These, then, were the events of this year. When Lysistratus was archon in Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Lucius Pinarius Mamertinus and Publius Furius Phaephron. In this year, Hieron, the king of the Syracusans, summoning to Syracuse the sons of Anaxilas, the former tyrant of Zancle, and giving them great gifts, reminded them of the benefactions Gelon had rendered their father, and advised them, now that they had come of age, to require an accounting of Micithus, their guardian, and themselves to take over the government of Zancle. And when they had returned to Rhegium, and required of their guardian an accounting of his administration, Micithus, who was an upright man, gathered together the old family friends of the children, and rendered so honest an accounting that all present were filled with admiration of both his justice and good faith, and the children, regretting the steps they had taken, begged Micithus to take back the administration and to conduct the affairs of the state with a father's power and position. Micithus, however, did not accede to the request, but after turning everything over to them punctiliously and putting his own goods aboard a boat, he set sail from Rhegium, accompanied by the goodwill of the populace, and reaching Greece, he spent the rest of his life in Tegea in Arcadia, enjoying the approval of men. And Hieron, the king of the Syracusans, died in Catana and received the honors which are accorded to heroes, as having been the founder of the city. He had ruled 11 years, and he left the kingdom to his brother Thrasybulus, who ruled over the Syracusans for 1 year. When Lysanias was archon in Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Appius Claudius and Titus Quintius Capitolinus. During this year, Thrasybulus, the king of the Syracusans, was driven from his throne, and since we are writing a detailed account of this event, we must go back a few years and set forth clearly the whole story from the beginning. Gelon, the son of Deinomides, who far excelled all other men in valor and strategy and outgeneraled the Carthaginians, defeated these barbarians in a great battle, as has been told, and since he treated the peoples whom he had subdued with fairness and, in general, conducted himself humanely toward all his immediate neighbors, he enjoyed high favor among the Sicilian Greeks. Thus, Gelon, being beloved by all because of his mild rule, lived in uninterrupted peace until his death. But Hieron, the next oldest among the brothers, who succeeded to the throne, did not rule over his subjects in the same manner, for he was avaricious and violent and, speaking generally, an utter stranger to sincerity and nobility of character. Consequently, there were a good many who wished to revolt, but they restrained their inclinations because of Gelon's reputation and the goodwill he had shown towards all the Sicilian Greeks. After the death of Hieron, however, his brother Thrasybulus, who succeeded to the throne, surpassed in wickedness his predecessor in the kingship. For being a violent man and murderous by nature, he put to death many citizens unjustly and drove not a few into exile on false charges, confiscating their possessions into the royal treasury. And since, speaking generally, he hated those he had wronged and was hated by them, he enlisted a large body of mercenaries, preparing in this way a legion with which to oppose the citizen soldiery. And since he kept incurring more and most the hatred of the citizens by outraging many and executing others, he compelled the victims to revolt. Consequently, the Syracusans, choosing men who would take the lead, set about as one man to destroy the tyranny, and once they had been organized by their leaders, they clung stubbornly to their freedom. When Thrasybulus saw that the whole city was in arms against him, he at first attempted to stop the revolt by persuasion, but after he observed that the movement of the Syracusans could not be halted, he gathered together both the colonists, whom Hieron had settled in Catana, and his other allies, as well as a multitude of mercenaries, so that his army numbered all told almost 15,000 men. Then, seizing Acradine, as it is called, and the island, which was fortified, and using them as bases, he began a war upon the revolting citizens. The Syracusans at the outset seized a part of the city which is called Tyche, and operating from there, they dispatched ambassadors to Gela, Acragas, and Selinus, and also to Himera and the cities of the Sicily in the interior of the island, asking them to come together with all speed and join with them in liberating Syracuse. And since all these cities acceded to this request eagerly and hurriedly dispatched aid, some of them infantry and cavalry and others warships fully equipped for action, in a brief time there was collected a considerable armament with which to aid the Syracusans. Consequently, the Syracusans, having made ready their ships and drawn up their army for battle, demonstrated that they were ready to fight to a finish both on land and on sea. Now, Thrasybulus, abandoned as he was by his allies and basing his hopes only upon the mercenaries, was master only of Acradine and the island, whereas the rest of the city was in the hands of the Syracusans. And after this, Thrasybulus sailed forth with his ships against the enemy, and after suffering defeat in the battle with the loss of numerous triremes, he withdrew with the remaining ships to the island. Similarly, he led forth his army also from Acradine, and drew them up for battle in the suburbs, but he suffered defeat, and was forced to retire with heavy losses back to Acradine. In the end, giving up hope of maintaining the tyranny, he opened negotiations with the Syracusans, came to an understanding with them, and retired under a truce to Locris. The Syracusans, having liberated their native city in this manner, gave permission to the mercenaries to withdraw from Syracuse, and they liberated the other cities, which were either in the hands of tyrants or had garrisons, and re-established democracies in them. From this time, the city enjoyed peace and increased greatly in prosperity, and it maintained its democracy for almost 60 years, until the tyranny which was established by Dionysius. But Thrasybulus, who had taken over a kingship which had been established on so fair a foundation, disgracefully lost his kingdom through his own wickedness, and fleeing to Locri, he spent the rest of his life there in private station. While these events were taking place, in Rome this year for the first time, 4 tribunes were elected to office: Gaius Sicinius, Lucius Numitorius, Marcus Duilius, and Spurius Achillius, With the passing of this year, in Athens, Lysitheus was archon, and in Rome, the consuls elected were Lucius Valerius Publicola and Titus Aemilius Mamercus. During this year, in Asia Artabanus, an Hyrcanian by birth, who enjoyed the greatest influence at the court of King Xerxes and was captain of the royal bodyguard, decided to slay Xerxes and transfer the kingship to himself. He communicated the plot to Mithridates the eunuch, who was the king's chamberlain and enjoyed his supreme confidence, and he, since he was also a relative of Artabanus as well as his friend, agreed to the plot. And Artabanus, being led at night by Mithridates into the king's bedchamber, slew Xerxes and then set out after the king's son. These were 3 in number, Darius the eldest and Artaxerxes, who were both living in the palace, and the third, Hystaspes, who happened to be away from home at the time, since he was administering the satrapy of Bactria. Now Artabanus, coming while it was yet night to Artaxerxes, told him that his brother Darius had murdered his father and was shifting the kingship to himself. He counseled him, therefore, before Darius should seize the throne, to see to it that he should not become a slave through sheer indifference, but that he should ascend the throne after punishing the murderer of his father, and he promised to get the bodyguard of the king to support him in the undertaking. Artaxerxes fell in with the advice, and at once, with the help of the bodyguard, slew his brother Darius. And when Artabanus saw how his plan was prospering, he called his own sons to his side, and crying out that now was his time to win the kingship, he strikes Artaxerxes with his sword. Artaxerxes, being wounded merely and not seriously hurt by the blow, held off Artabanus, and dealing him a fatal blow, killed him. Thus Artaxerxes, after being saved in this unexpected fashion, and having taken vengeance upon the slayer of his father, took over the kingship of the Persians. So Xerxes died in the manner we have described, after having been king of the Persians for more than 20 years, and Artaxerxes succeeded to the kingship and ruled for 40 years. When Archidamedes was archon in Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Aulus Virginius and Titus Minucius, and the 79th Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Xenophon of Corinth won the stadion. In this year, the Thasians revolted from the Athenians because of a quarrel over mines, but they were forced to capitulate by the Athenians and compelled to subject themselves again to their rule. Similarly also, when the Aeginetans revolted, the Athenians, intending to reduce them to subjection, undertook the siege of Aegina, for this state, being often successful in its engagements at sea, was puffed up with pride and was also well provided with both money and triremes, and, in a word, was constantly at odds with the Athenians. Consequently, they sent an army against it and laid waste its territory, and then, laying siege to Aegina, they bent every effort on taking it by storm. For, speaking generally, the Athenians, now that they were making great advances in power, no longer treated their allies fairly, as they had formerly done, but were ruling them harshly and arrogantly. Consequently, most of the allies, unable longer to endure their severity, were discussing rebellion with each other, and some of them, scorning the authority of the General Congress, were acting as independent states. While these events were taking place, the Athenians, who were now masters of the sea, dispatched 10,000 colonists to Amphipolis, recruiting a part of them from their own citizens and a part from the allies. They portioned out the territory in allotments, and for a time held the upper hand over the Thracians, but at a later time, as a result of their further advance into Thrace, all who entered the country of the Thracians were slain by a people known as the Edanes. When Topolamus was archon in Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Titus Quintius and Quintus Servilius Structus. This year, Artaxerxes, the king of the Persians, who had just recovered the throne, first of all punished those who had had a part in the murder of his father, and then organized the affairs of the kingdom to suit his own personal advantage. Thus, with respect to the satraps then in office, those who were hostile to him he dismissed, and from his friends he chose such as were competent and gave the satrapies to them. He also concerned himself with both the revenues and the preparation of armaments, and since in general his administration of the entire kingdom was mild, he enjoyed the favor of the Persians to a high degree. But when the inhabitants of Egypt learned of the death of Xerxes and of the general attempt upon the throne and the disorder in the Persian kingdom, they decided to strike for their liberty. At once then, mustering an army, they revolted from the Persians, and after expelling the Persians whose duty it was to collect the tribute from Egypt, they set up as king a man named Inaros. He had first recruited soldiers from the native Egyptians, but afterwards he gathered also mercenaries from the other nations and amassed a considerable army. He dispatched ambassadors also to the Athenians to effect an alliance, promising them that, if they should liberate the Egyptians, he would give them a share in the kingdom and grant them favors many times greater than the good service they had rendered. And the Athenians, having decided that it was to their advantage to humble the Persians as far as they could and to attach the Egyptians closely to themselves against the unpredictable shiftings of fortune, voted to send 300 triremes to the aid of the Egyptians. The Athenians, therefore, with great enthusiasm set about the preparation of the expedition. As for Artaxerxes, when he learned of the revolt of the Egyptians and their preparations for war, he concluded that he must surpass the Egyptians in the size of his armaments, so he at once began to enroll soldiers from all the satrapies, build ships, and give his attention to every other kind of preparation. These were the events of this year in Asia and Egypt. In Sicily, as soon as the tyranny of Syracuse had been overthrown and all the cities of the island had been liberated, the whole of Sicily was making great strides toward prosperity. For the Sicilian Greeks were at peace, and the land they cultivated was fertile, so that the abundance of their harvests enabled them soon to increase their estates and to fill the land with slaves and domestic animals and every other accompaniment of prosperity, taking in great revenues on the one hand and spending nothing upon the wars to which they had been accustomed. But later on, they were again plunged into wars and civil strife for the following reasons. After the Syracusans had overthrown the tyranny of Thrasybulus, they held a meeting of the assembly, and after deliberating on forming a democracy of their own, they all voted unanimously to make a colossal statue of Zeus the Liberator, and each year to celebrate with sacrifices the festival of liberation and hold games of distinction on the day 1, which they had overthrown the tyrant and liberated their native city, and they also voted to sacrifice to the gods in connection with the games 450 bulls and to use them for the citizens' feast. As for all the magistracies, they proposed to assign them to the original citizens, but the aliens who had been admitted to citizenship under Gelon, they did not see fit to allow to share in this dignity, either because they judged them to be unworthy or because they were suspicious lest men who had been brought up in the way of tyranny and had served in war under a monarch might attempt a revolution. And that is what actually happened. For Gelon had enrolled as citizens more than 10,000 foreign mercenaries, and of these there were left at the time in question more than 7,000. These aliens resented their being excluded from the dignity attending magistracies, and with one accord revolted from the Syracusans, and they seized in the city both Acradine and the island, both these places having their own well-built fortifications. The Syracusans, who were again plunged into disorder, held possession of the rest of the city, and that part of it which faced Epipola they blocked off by a wall and made their own position very secure. For anyone easily cut off the rebels from access to the countryside and soon caused them to be in want of provisions. But though in number the mercenaries were inferior to the Syracusans, yet in experience of warfare they were far superior. Consequently, when attacks took place here and there throughout the city and isolated encounters, the mercenaries regularly had the upper hand in the combats, but since they were shut off from the countryside, they were in want of equipment and short of food. Such were the events in Sicily of this year. When Conon was archon in Athens, in Rome the consulship was held by Quintus Fabius Vibulanus and Tiberius Aemilius Mamercus. This year Artaxerxes, the king of the Persians, appointed Achaemenes, who was a son of Darius and his own uncle, to be commander in the war against the Egyptians, and turning over to him more than 300,000 soldiers, counting both cavalry and infantry, he commanded them to subdue the Egyptians. Now Achaemenes, when he had entered Egypt, pitched his camp near the Nile, and when he had rested his army after the march, he made ready for battle, but the Egyptians, having gathered their army from Libya and Egypt, were awaiting the auxiliary force of the Athenians. After the Athenians had arrived in Egypt with 200 ships and had been drawn up with the Egyptians in battle order against the Persians, a mighty struggle took place, and for a time the Persians with their superior numbers maintained the advantage, but later, when the Athenians seized the offensive, put to flight the forces opposing them, and slew many of them, the remainder of the barbarians turned to flight in mass. There was much slaughter in the course of the flight, and finally the Persians, after losing the larger part of their army, found refuge in the White Fortress, as it is called, while the Athenians, who had won the victory by their own deeds of valor, pursued the barbarians as far as the aforesaid stronghold and did not hesitate to besiege it. Artaxerxes, on learning of the defeat of his troops, at first sent some of his friends with a large sum of money to Lacedaemon, and asked the Lacedaemonians to make war upon the Athenians, thinking that if they complied, the Athenian troops who had won the victory in Egypt would sail back to Athens in order to defend their native city. When the Lacedaemonians, however, neither accepted money nor paid any attention whatever to the requests of the Persians, Artaxerxes despaired of getting any aid from the Lacedaemonians and set about preparing other armaments. In command of them, he placed Artabazus and Megabyzus, men of outstanding merit, and dispatched them to make war upon the Egyptians. When Euthippus was archon in Athens, the Romans chose as consuls Quintus Servilius and Spurius Postumius Albinus. During this year, in Asia, Artabazus and Megabyzus, who had been dispatched to the war against the Egyptians, set out from Persia with more than 300,000 soldiers, counting both cavalry and infantry. When they arrived in Cilicia and Phoenicia, they rested their land forces after the journey and commanded the Cyprians and Phoenicians and Cilicians to supply ships. And when the triremes had been made ready, they fitted them out with the ablest marines and arms and missiles and everything else that is useful in naval warfare. So these leaders were busy with their preparations and with giving their soldiers training and accustoming every man to the practice of warfare, and they spent almost this entire year in this way. Meanwhile, the Athenians in Egypt were besieging the troops which had taken refuge near Memphis in the White Fortress. But since the Persians were putting up a stout defense, they were unable to take the stronghold, and so spent the year in the siege. In Sicily, the Syracusans, in their war upon the mercenaries who had revolted, kept launching attack after attack upon both Acradine and the island, and they defeated the rebels in a sea battle. But on land, they were unable to expel them from the city because of the strength of these two places. Later, however, after an open battle had been fought on land, the soldiers engaged on both sides fighting spiritedly. Finally, although both armies suffered not a few casualties, victory lay with the Syracusans. And after the battle, the Syracusans honored with the prize of valor the elite troops, 600 in number, who were responsible for the victory, giving them each a mina of silver. While these events were taking place, Ducetius, the leader of the Siceli, harboring a grudge against the inhabitants of Catana because they had robbed the Sicily of their land, led an army against them. And since the Syracusans had likewise sent an army against Catana, they and the Sicily joined in portioning out the land in allotments among themselves and made war upon the settlers who had been sent by Hieron when he was ruler of Syracuse. The Catanians opposed them with arms, but were defeated in a number of engagements and were expelled from Catana, and they took possession of what is now Aetna, which was formerly called Inessa, and the original inhabitants of Catana, after a long period, got back their native city. After these events, the peoples who had been expelled from their own cities while Hieron was king, now that they had assistance in struggle, returned to their fatherlands and expelled from their cities the men who had wrongfully seized for themselves the habitations of others. Among these were inhabitants of Gela, Acragas, and Himera. In like manner, Rhegians, along with Zancleans, expelled the sons of Anaxilas, who were ruling over them, and liberated their fatherlands. Later on, Galones, who had been the original settlers of Camarina, portioned that land out in allotments, and practically all the cities, being eager to make an end of the wars, came to a common decision whereby they made terms with the mercenaries in their midst. They then received back the exiles and restored the cities to the original citizen. But to the mercenaries, who because of the former tyrannical governments were in possession of the cities belonging to others, they gave permission to take with them their own goods and to settle one and all in Messenia. In this manner, then, an end was put to the civil wars and disorders which had prevailed throughout the cities of Sicily, and the cities, after driving out the forms of government which aliens had introduced, with almost no exceptions portioned out their lands in allotments among all their citizens. When Phrasicleides was archon in Athens, the 80th Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Torillas the Thessalian won the stadion, and the Romans elected as consuls Quintus Fabius and Titus Quintius Capitolinus. During this year, in Asia, the Persian generals who had passed over to Cilicia made ready 300 ships, which they fitted out fully for warfare, and then with their land force they advanced overland through Syria and Phoenicia. And with the fleet accompanying the army along the coast, they arrived at Memphis in Egypt. At the outset, they broke the siege of the White Fortress, having struck the Egyptians and the Athenians with terror. But later on, adopting a prudent course, they avoided any frontal encounters and strove to bring the war to an end by the use of stratagems. Accordingly, since the Attic ships lay moored at the island known as Prosopitis, they diverted by means of canals the river which flowed around the island and thus made the island a part of the mainland. When the ships thus all of a sudden came to rest on the dry land, the Egyptians in alarm left the Athenians in the lurch and came to terms with the Persians. The Athenians, being now without allies and seeing that their ships had become useless, set fire to them to prevent their falling into the hands of the enemy, and then themselves, undismayed at the alarming plight they were in, fell to exhorting one to do nothing unworthy of the fights they had won in the past. Consequently, with a display of deeds of valor surpassing in heroism the men who perished in Thermopylae in defense of Greece, they stood ready to fight it out with the enemy. But the Persian generals, Artabazus and Megabyzus, taking note of the exceptional courage of their foes and reasoning that they would be unable to annihilate such men without sacrificing many myriads of their own, made a truce with the Athenians, whereby they should with impunity depart from Egypt. So the Athenians, having saved their lives by their courage, departed from Egypt, and making their way through Libya to Cyrene, got safely back, as by a miracle, to their native land. While these events were taking place, in Athens Ephialtes, the son of Sophonides, who, being a popular leader, had provoked the masses to anger against the Areopagites, persuaded the assembly to vote to curtail the power of the council of the Areopagus, and to destroy the renowned customs which their fathers had followed. Nevertheless, he did not escape the punishment for attempting such lawlessness, but he was done to death by night, and none ever knew how he lost his life. At the conclusion of this year, Philocles was archon in Athens, and in Rome, Aulus Postumius Regulus and Spurius Furius Mediolanus succeeded to the consulship. During this year, a war arose between the Corinthians and Epidaurians on the one hand, and the Athenians on the other, and the Athenians took the field against them, and after a sharp battle were victorious. With a large fleet, they put in at a place called Halius, landed on the Peloponnesus, and slew not a few of the enemy. But the Peloponnesians rallied and gathered a strong force, and it came to a battle with the Athenians near the place called Secrophilea, in which the Athenians were again victorious. After such successes, the Athenians, seeing that the Aeginetans were not only puffed up over their former achievements, but also hostile to Athens, decided to reduce them by war. Therefore, the Athenians dispatched a strong fleet against them. The inhabitants of Aegina, however, who had great experience in fighting at sea and enjoyed a great reputation therefore, were not dismayed at the superiority of the Athenians. But since they had a considerable number of triremes and had built some new ones, they engaged the Athenians in battle, but were defeated with the loss of 70 ships, and, their spirits crushed by so great a disaster, they were forced to join the league which paid tribute to Athenians. This was accomplished for the Athenians by their general Leocrates, who was engaged in the war with the Aeginetans 9 months in all. While these events were taking place, in Sicily, the king of the Siceli, Ducetius, a man of famous family and influential at this time, founded the city of Menaeanum and distributed the neighboring territory among the settlers, and making a campaign against the strong city of Morgantina and reducing it, he won fame among his own people. At the close of the year, Bion was archon in Athens, and in Rome, Publius Servilius Structus and Lucius Albus succeeded to the consulship. During this year, a quarrel arose between the Corinthians and Megarians over land on their borders, and the cities went to war. At first, they kept making raids on each other's territory and engaging in clashes of small parties. But as the quarrel increased, the Megarians, who were increasingly getting the worse of it and stood in fear of the Corinthians, made allies of the Athenians. As a result, the cities were again equal in military strength, and when the Corinthians together with Peloponnesians advanced into Megares with a strong army, the Athenians sent troops to the aid of the Megarians under the command of Myronide, a man who was admired for his valor. A fierce engagement took place which lasted a long time, and each side matched the other in deeds of courage. But at last victory lay with the Athenians, who slew many of the enemy. And after a few days there was another fierce battle at Simolia, as it is called, and again the Athenians were victorious and slew many of the enemy. Or the Phocians went to war with the Dorians, who are the original stock of the Lacedaemonians and dwell in the 3 cities, Cytinium, Boeum, and Erineus, which lie at the base of Myti Parnassus. Now at first they subdued the Dorians by force of arms and occupied their cities. But after this, the Lacedaemonians, because of their kinship, dispatched Nicomedes, the son of Cleomenes, to the aid of the Dorians. He had 1,500 Lacedaemonians and 10,000 men from the rest of the Peloponnesians. So Nicomedes, who was the guardian of Plestonax the king, who was still a child, came to the aid of the Dorians with this large army, and after inflicting a defeat upon the Phocians and recovering the cities they had seized, he made peace between the Phocians and the Dorians. When the Athenians learned that the Lacedaemonians had concluded the war against the Phocians and were about to make their return home, they decided to attack the Lacedaemonians while on the march. Accordingly, they dispatched an army against them, including in it Argives and Thessalians, and, with the intention of falling upon them with 50 ships and 14,000 men, they occupied the passes about Mate Gerenia. But the Lacedaemonians, having information of the plans of the Athenians, took the route to Tanagra in Boeotia. The Athenians advanced into Boeotia and formed in line of battle, and a fierce struggle took place. And although in the fighting the Thessalians deserted to the Lacedaemonians, nonetheless the Athenians and the Argives fought the battle through, and not a few fell in both armies before night put an end to the struggle. After this, when a large supply train was on its way from Attica for the Athenians, The Thessalians decided to attack it, and taking their evening meal at once, they intercepted by night the supply train. The Athenians, who were guarding the train, were unaware that the Thessalians had changed sides and received them as friends, so that many conflicts of various kinds broke out around the convoy. For at first, the Thessalians, who'd been welcomed by the enemy in their ignorance, kept cutting down all whom they met, and being an organized band engaging with men who had fallen into confusion, they slew many of the guards. But the Athenians in the camp, when they learned of the attack of the Thessalians, came up with all speed, and routing the Thessalians at the first charge, they were making a great slaughter of them. The Lacedaemonians, however, now came to the rescue of the Thessalians with their army in battle order, and a pitched battle between the two armies ensued, and such was their rivalry that many were slain on both sides. And finally, since the battle ended in a tie, both the Lacedaemonians and the Athenians laid claim to the victory. However, since night intervened and the victory was still a matter of dispute, each sent envoys to the other, and they concluded a truce of 4 months. When the year ended, in Athens Menesithenes was Archon, and in Rome the consuls elected were Lucius Lucretius and Titus Veturius Sicerinus. During this year, the Thebans, who had been humbled because of their alliance with Xerxes, sought a way by which they might recover both their ancient influence and reputation. Consequently, since all the Boeotians held the Thebans in disdain and no longer paid any attention to them, the Thebans asked the Lacedaemonians to aid them in winning for their city the hegemony over all Boeotia, and they promised that in return for this favor they would make war by themselves upon the Athenians, so that it would no longer be necessary for the Spartans to lead troops beyond the border of the Peloponnesus. And the Lacedaemonians assented, judging the proposal to be to their advantage, and believing that, if Thebes should grow in strength, she would be a kind of counterweight to the increasing power of the Athenians. Consequently, since they had at the time a large army in readiness at Tanagra, they increased the extent of the circuit wall of Thebes and compelled the cities of Boeotia to subject themselves to the Thebans. The Athenians, however, being eager to break up the plan of the Lacedaemonians, made ready a large army and elected as General Myronides the son of Callias. He enrolled the required number of citizens and gave them orders, announcing a day on which he planned to march forth from the city. And when the appointed time arrived, and some of the soldiers had not put in appearance at the specified rendezvous, he took those who had reported and advanced into Boeotia. And when certain of his officers and friends said that he should wait for the tardy men, Myronides, who was not only a sagacious general but energetic as well, replied that he would not do so, for, he declared, men of their own choice are late for the departure will in battle also play an ignoble and cowardly part, and will therefore not withstand the perils of war in defense of their country either. Whereas the men who presented themselves ready for service on the appointed day gave clear evidence that they would not desert their posts in the war. And this is what actually took place, for leading forth soldiers who were few in number but the bravest in courage, he drew them up in Boeotia against a vastly superior force and utterly defeated his opponents. In my opinion, this action was in no way inferior to any of the battles fought by the Athenians in former times, for neither the victory at Marathon nor the success over the Persians at Plataea nor the other renowned exploits of the Athenians seem in any way to surpass the victory which Myronides won over the Boeotians. For of those other battles, some were fought against barbarians, and others were gained with the aid of allies. But this struggle was won by the Athenians single-handed in pitched battle, and they were pitted against the bravest warriors to be found among the Greeks. For in staunchness, in the face of perils, and in the fierce contests of war, the Boeotians are generally believed to be surpassed by no other people. At any rate, sometime after this, the Thebans at Leuctra and Mantinea, when they unaided confronted all the Lacedaemonians and their allies, won for themselves the highest reputation for courage, and contrary to expectation, became the leading nation of all Greece. And yet, although the Battle of Myronides has become famous, none of our historians has described either the way it was fought or the disposition of the troops engaged in it. Myronides, then, after defeating the Boeotians in a remarkable battle, came to rival the reputations of the most renowned commanders before his time, namely Themistocles, Miltiades, and Cimon. Myronides, after this victory, took Tanagra by siege, levelled its walls, and then he passed through all Boeotia, breaking it up and destroying it, and dividing the booty among his soldiers, he loaded them all down with spoil in abundance. The Boeotians, exasperated by the wasting of their land, sprang to arms as a nation, and when they had taken the field constituted a great army. A battle took place at Oenophyta in Boeotia, and since both sides withstood the stress of the conflict with stout hearts, they spent the day in fighting. But after a severe struggle, the Athenians put the Boeotians to flight, and Myronides became master of all the cities of Boeotia, with the exception of Thebes. After this, he marched out of Boeotia and led his army against the Locrians, who are known as Opuntian. These he overpowered at the first attack, and taking hostages from them, he then entered Parnasia. In like manner as he had done with the Locrians, he also subdued the Phocians, and after taking hostages, he marched into Thessaly, finding fault with the Thessalians for their act of treachery, and ordering them to receive back their exiles. And when the Thessalians would not open their gates to him, he laid siege to the city. But since he could not master the city by force, and the Thessalians held out for a long time against the siege, for the purpose he gave up his designs regarding Thessaly and returned to Athens. Thus Myronides, who had performed great deeds in a short space of time, won among his fellow citizens the renown which was so widely acclaimed. These, then, were the events of this year. While Callias was archon in Athens, in Elis the 81st Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Polymnastus of Cyrene won the Stadion, and in Rome the consuls were Servius Sulpicius and Publius Volumnius Amentinus. During this year, Tolmides, who was commander of the naval forces and vied with both the valor and fame of Myronides, was eager to accomplish a memorable deed. Consequently, since in those times no one had ever yet laid waste Laconia, he urged the Athenian people to ravage the territory of the Spartans, and he promised that by taking 11,000 hoplites aboard the triremes, he would with them lay waste Laconia and dim the fame of the Spartans. When the Athenians acceded to his request, he then, wishing to take with him secretly a larger number of hoplites, had recourse to the following cunning subterfuge. The citizens thought that he would enroll for the force the young men in the prime of youth and most vigorous in body, but Tolmides, determined to take with him in the campaign not merely the stipulated 1,000, approached every young man of exceptional hardihood and told him that he was going to enroll him. It would be better, however, he added, for him to go as a volunteer than be thought to have been compelled to serve under compulsion by enrollment. When by this scheme he had persuaded more than 3,000 to enroll voluntarily, and saw that the rest of the youth showed no further interest, he then enrolled the 1,000 he had been promised from all who were left. When all the other preparations for his expedition had been made, Tolmides set out to sea with 50 triremes and 4,000 hoplites, and putting in at Methone in Laconia, he took the place, and when the Lacedaemonians came to defend it, he withdrew, and cruising along the coast to Gythium, which was a seaport of the Lacedaemonians, he seized it, burned the city and also the dockyards of the Lacedaemonians, and ravaged its territory. From here he set out to sea and sailed to Zacynthos, which belonged to Cephallenia. He took the island and won over all the cities on Cephallenia, and then sailed across to the opposite mainland and put in at Naupactus. This city he likewise seized at the first assault, and in it he settled the prominent Messenians whom the Lacedaemonians had allowed to go free under a truce. At this time, it may be explained, the Lacedaemonians had finally overcome both the Helots and Messenians, with whom they had been at war over a long period, and the Messenians they had allowed to depart from Ithome under a truce, as we have said. But of the Helots they had punished those who were responsible for the revolt and had enslaved the rest. When Sosistratus was archon in Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Publius Valerius Publicola and Gaius Clodius Regillus. In this year, Tolmides was occupied in Boeotia, and the Athenians elected as general a man of the aristocracy, Pericles the son of Xanthippus, and giving him 50 triremes and 1,000 hoplites, sent him against the Peloponnesus. He ravaged a large part of the Peloponnesus, and then sailed across to Acarnania, and won over to Athens all the cities, with the exception of Oeniade. So the Athenians during this year controlled a very large number of cities, and won great fame for valor and generalship. When Ariston was archon in Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Quintus Fabius Vibulanus and Lucius Cornelius Curitinus. This year, the Athenians and Peloponnesians agreed to a truce of 5 years, Cimon the Athenian having conducted the negotiation. In Sicily, a war arose between the peoples of Egesta and Lilybaeum over the land on the Mazaros River, and in a sharp battle which ensued both cities lost heavily but did not slacken their rivalry. And after the enrollment of citizens which had taken place in the cities and the redistribution of the lands, since many had been added to the roll of citizens without plan and in a haphazard fashion, the cities were in an unhealthy state and falling back again into civil strife and disorders, and it was especially in Syracuse that this malady prevailed. For a man by the name of Tyndaredes, a rash fellow full of effrontery, began by gathering about him many of the poor, and organizing them into an armed unit, he proceeded to make of them a personal bodyguard ready for an attempt to set up a tyranny. Not after this, when it was evident that he was grasping after supreme power, he was brought to trial and condemned to death. But while he was being led off to prison, the men upon whom he had lavished his favors rushed together and laid hands upon those who were arresting him. And in the confusion which arose throughout the city, the most respectable citizens, who had organized themselves, seized the revolutionists and put them to death along with Tyndaredes. And since this sort of thing kept happening time and again, and there were men whose hearts were set on a tyranny, the people were led to imitate the Athenians and to establish a law very similar to the one they had passed on ostracism. Now, among the Athenians, each citizen was required to write on a potsherd ostracon, the name of the man who, in his opinion, was most able through his influence to tyrannize over his fellow citizens. But among the Syracusans, the name of the most influential citizen had to be written on an olive leaf, and when the leaves were counted, the man who received the largest number of leaves had to go into exile for 5 years. For by this means they thought that they would humble the arrogance of the most powerful men in these 2 cities. For, speaking generally, they were not exacting from violators of the law a punishment for a crime committed, but were effecting a diminution of the influence and growing power of the men in question. Now, while the Athenians called this kind of legislation ostracism, from the way it was done, the Syracusans used the name petalism. This law remained in force among the Athenians for a long time, but among the Syracusans it was soon repealed for the following reasons. Since the most influential men were being sent into exile, the most respectable citizens and such as had it in their power, by reason of their high personal character, to effect many reforms in the affairs of the Commonwealth, were taking no part in public affairs, but consistently remained in private life because of their fear of the law, attending to their personal fortunes and leaning towards a life of luxury, whereas it was the basest citizens and such as excelled in effrontery who were giving their attention to public affairs and inciting the masses to disorder and revolution. Consequently, since factional quarrels were again arising, the masses were turning to wrangling, the city fell back into continuous and serious disorders. For a multitude of demagogues and sycophants was arising, the youth were cultivating cleverness and oratory, and, in a word, many were exchanging the ancient and sober way of life for the ignoble pursuits. Wealth was increasing because of the peace, but there was little, if any, concern for concord and honest conduct. As a result, the Syracusans changed their minds and repealed the law petalism, having used it only a short while. Such, then, was the state of affairs in Sicily. When Lysicrates was archon in Athens, in Rome the consuls elected were Gaius Nautius Rutilius and Lucius Minucius Carutianus. During this year Pericles, the general of the Athenians, landed in the Peloponnesus and ravaged the territory of the Sicyonians. And when the Sicyonians came out against him in full force and a battle was fought, Pericles was victorious, slew many as they fled and shut them up in their city, to which he laid siege. But when he was unable by making assaults upon the walls to take the city, and when, besides, the Lacedaemonians sent aid to the besieged, he withdrew from Sicyon. They withdrew from Sicyon. He withdrew from Sicyo, Acarnania, where he overran the territory of Oeniade, amassed much booty, and then sailed away from Acarnania. After this, he arrived at the Chersonese and portioned out the land in allotments to 1,000 citizens. While these events were taking place, Tolmides, the other general, passed over into Euboea and divided it and the land of the Naxians among another 1,000 citizens. As for the events in Sicily, since the Tyrrhenians were practicing piracy at sea, the Syracusans chose Phalus as admiral and sent him to Tyrrhenia. He sailed at first to the island known as Aethalaia and ravaged it, but he secretly accepted a bribe of money from the Tyrrhenians and sailed back to Sicily without having accomplished anything worthy of mention. The Syracusans found him guilty of treachery and exiled him, and choosing another general, Apelles, they dispatched him with 60 triremes against the Tyrrhenians. He overran the coast of Tyrrhenia and then passed over to Cyrnus, which was held at those times by the Tyrrhenians, and after sacking many places in this island and subduing Aethalaia, he returned to Syracuse accompanied by a multitude of captives and not a little other spoil. And after this Ducetius, the leader of the Sicili, gathered all the cities which were of the same race, with the exception of Hybla, into one and a common federation, and being an energetic man, he was always grasping after innovations, and so he gathered a large army from the Sicilian League and removed the city of Menae, which was his native state, and planted it in the plain. Also near the sacred precinct of the Pallaci, as they are called, he founded an important city, which he named Pallas, after the gods just mentioned. Since we have spoken of these gods, we should not omit to mention both the antiquity and the incredible nature of the shrine, and, in a word, the peculiar phenomenon of the craters, as they are called. The myth relates that this sacred area surpasses all others in antiquity, and the reverence paid to it, and many marvels there are reported by tradition. For, first of all, there are craters which are not at all large in size, but they throw up extraordinary streams of water from a depth beyond telling, and have very much the nature of cauldrons which are heated by a strong fire and throw up boiling water. Now the water that is thrown up gives the impression of being boiling hot, but this is not known for certain because of the fact that no man dares touch it. For the amazement caused by the spout of water is so great that men believe the phenomenon to be due to some divine power. For not only does the water give out a strongly sulphurous smell, but the yawning mouth emits a mighty and terrifying roar, and what is still more astonishing than this, the water neither pours over nor recedes, but has a motion and force in its current that lifts it to a marvelous height. Since so divine a majesty pervades the sacred area, the most sacred oaths are taken there, and men who swear falsely are immediately overtaken by the punishment of heaven. Thus certain men have lost their sight when they depart from the sacred precinct. And so great is the awe of the deities of this shrine that men who are pressing claims when, for instance, they are being overborne by a person of superior dignity, have their claims adjudicated on the strength of the preliminary examination of the witnesses supported by oaths taken in the name of these deities. This sacred area has also been recognized for some time as a place of sanctuary and has been a source of great aid to luckless slaves who have fallen into the hands of brutal masters, for if they have fled there for refuge, their masters have no power to remove them by force, and they remain there protected from harm until their masters, having gained their consent upon conditions of humane treatment and having given pledges, supported by such oaths, to fulfill their agreements, lead them away. And history records no case, out of all who have given slaves such a pledge as this, of a violation. So faithful to their slaves does the awe in which these gods are held make those who have taken the oath, and the sacred area, which lies on a plain meet for a god, has been appropriately embellished with colonnades and every other kind of lounging place. But let what we have said suffice for this subject, and we shall return to the narrative at the point where our history broke off. Ducetius, after founding Pallas and enclosing it with strong walls, portioned out the neighboring countryside in allotments. And it came to pass that this city, on account of the fertility of the soil and the multitude of the colonists, enjoyed a rapid growth. It did not, however, prosper for long, but was razed to the ground and has remained without habitation until our own day. Regarding this, we shall give a detailed account in connection with the appropriate period of time. Such, then, was the state of affairs in Sicily. In Italy, 58 years after the Crotoniates had destroyed Sybaris, a Thessalian gathered together the Sybarites, who remained and founded Sybaris anew. It lay between two rivers, the Sybaris and the Crathes, and since the settlers possessed a fertile land, they quickly advanced in wealth. But they had possessed the city only a few years, when they were again driven out of Sybaris, regarding which event we shall undertake to give a detailed account in the following book. The year 452 BCE is lacking, when Antidotus was archon in Athens, The Romans elected as consuls Lucius Postumius and Marcus Horatius. During this year, Ducetius, who held the leadership of the Sicily, seized the city of Aetna, having treacherously slain its leader, and then he moved with an army into the territory of the Agrigentini and laid siege to Motiumi, which was held by a garrison of Agrigentini, and when the Agrigentini and the Syracusans came to the aid of the city, he joined battle with them, was successful, and drove them both out of their camps. But since at the time winter was setting in, they separated and returned to their homes, and the Syracusans found their general Vulcan, who was responsible for the defeat and was thought to have had secret dealings with Ducetius, guilty of treason, and put him to death. With the beginning of summer, they appointed a new general, to whom they assigned a strong army with orders to subdue Ducetius. This general, setting out with his army, came upon Ducetius while he was encamped near Nomae. A fierce struggle ensued, and many fell on both sides, but with difficulty the Syracusans overpowered and routed the Sicily, slaying many of them as they fled. Of those who survived the battle, the larger number found safety in the strongholds of the Sicily, but a few chose to share the hopes of Ducetius. While these things were taking place, the Agrigentini forced the capitulation of the stronghold of Motium, which was held by the Sicily, who stayed with Ducetius, and then, uniting their troops with the Syracusans, who had already won the victory, they now camped together. As for Ducetius, now that he had been completely crushed by his defeat, and that some of his soldiers were deserting and others plotting against him, he had come to the depths of despair. Finally, when Ducetius saw that his remaining friends were about to lay hands upon him, he anticipated them by slipping away at night and riding off to Syracuse. And while it was still night, he entered the marketplace of the Syracusans, and seating himself at the altars, he became a suppliant of the city, placing both his person and the land, which he controlled, at the disposition of the Syracusans. When the multitude poured into the marketplace in amazement at the unexpected event, the magistrates called a meeting of the assembly and laid before it the question of what should be done with Ducetius. Some of those who were accustomed to curry favor with the people advised that they should punish him as an enemy and inflict on him for his misdeeds the appropriate penalty. But the more fair-minded of the elder citizens came forward and declared it as their opinion that they should spare the suppliant and show due regard for fortune and the wrath of the gods. The people should consider, they continued, not what punishment Ducetius deserved, but what action was proper for the Syracusans, for to slay the victim of fortune was not fitting, but to maintain reverence for the gods as well as to spare the suppliant was an act worthy of the magnanimity of the people. The people thereupon cried out as with one voice from every side to spare the suppliant. The Syracusans, accordingly, released Ducetius from punishment and sent him off to Corinth, ordering him to spend his life in that city, and also giving him sufficient means for this his support. Since we are now at the year preceding the campaign of the Athenians against Cyprus under the leadership of Cimon, pursuant to the plan announced at the beginning of this book, we herewith bring it to an end. The Lorb Editor's Notes. 1. The correct date is 464 BCE. 2. The famous Heraium, situated at about the same distance from Mycenae and Argos, in the hills south of the former. In it was later a celebrated statue of Hera, of gold and ivory, by Polyclitus. 3. These games had been first under the supervision of the city of Cleonae. The question of their supervision must have been in the air at this time, since it was transferred to Argos in 460 BCE. Or Phaephron is a corruption of Phusus. 5. CP. Chap. 49. 6. Kp. Chaps. 21 F. 7 Dinomides had 4 sons, Gelon, Hieron, Polyzelus, and Thrasybulus. 8 Acridine was the height north of the city, and the island is Ortygia, on which the palace and public buildings were located. 9 As a matter of fact, Acridine also was fortified, and the section adjoined Acridine on the west. 11 Epizopherian Locri on the toe of Italy. 12 In 406 BCE, Book 13.95 F. 13 Titus Numicius Priscus, according to Livy, 2.63. 14 A victory celebrated by Pindar, all. 13. 15 Those of Mit, Pangaeus, now Pianari, on the mainland, which yielded both gold and silver. The seizure of these mines by Philip of Macedon in 357 BCE, from which he derived in time an income of 1,000 talents a year, laid the financial basis for the rise of Macedonia to supreme power in Greece. 16 of the Delian League, Keep, Chap 47. 17 in the Battle of Drabescus, Cap, Book 12.68-2, Thucydides, 1.100. 18 Keep, Chap 69. 19, according to Thucydides, 1.104. This was a part of the city of Memphis. 20, about £4 sterling. 21 CP, Chap 49.1. 22 Kp, Chap 48. 23, i.e., to the descendants of the first settlers. 24, the most of them perished, says Thucydides, 1.110. 25 Halias is on the Argolic Gulf near Hermione. Thucydides, 1.105, says that the Athenians were defeated. 26 an island off Epidaurus. 27 this was the Battle of Tanagra. Thucydides, 1.108, in contradiction to Diodorus, states that the Lacedaemonians were victorious. At any rate, they returned home via the isthmus without any further opposition on the part of the Athenian. 28 during the Persian invasion. 29 in 371 and 362 BCE, respectively. 30 Thucydides, 1.108, mentions the Battle of Tanagra, supra, chap, 80, and that of Oenophyta, infra, chap, 83, but not this engagement, and the authority of Diodorus's account is questioned generally by modern historians. What Diodorus was to mistake two accounts of the same battle, of Oenophyta, for two battles, cp. Busalt, Grich, Jesh, 3.1, pre-319. 31, this refers to the dissolution of the Boeotian League under the hegemony of Thebes, which had just been re-established by the Spartans, chap. 80, 1.3. 32, the Locrians on the Strait of Euboea, so named after their capital Opus. 33, the beginning of the war is described in chap. 64, under the year 469, which is 5 years too early. 34 CP, chap 76. 35 CP, chap 55. 36 from Petalon, Leaf. 37 the Thracian in 447 BCE. 38 IE, in active command. 39 Elba. 40 Corsica. 41 the Greek word means mixing bowls. These geysers near Mit, Aetna, are mentioned by Virgil, Aeneid, 9.585, and described at length by Macrobius, Sat. 5.19, 15f. 42 there is no further mention of Pallas in the extant portions of Diodorus. 43 presumably one of the Thessalians mentioned in Book 12.10.2. 44 Book 12.9f, or 45 CP. Chap 1.1. The previous next to images with borders lead to more information. The thicker the border, the more information. Details here, thanks to Jonah Lendering of Livius for sharing in the labor of proofreading the web transcription of this book. Up to Diodorus, Classical Texts, Lacus Curtius Home. A page or image on this site is in the public domain only if its URL has a total of 1 asterisk. If the URL has 2 asterisks, the item is copyright someone else and used by permission or fair use. If the URL has none, the item is see Bill Thayer. See my copyright page for details and contact information. Page updated 5 Aug 16.